Towards the end of the 13th century, a large part of Cannock Forest in the English Midlands was cleared and hunting rights granted to the Bishop of Lichfield. In November 1292, Roger de Meyland led a hunting party across what was now known as Cannock Chase. He had no reason to suspect that, along with the deer and a dwindling population of wild boar, there was another large creature that avoided human contact. Hidden in the bracken, something was watching. Something feral, ferocious, and utterly savage. The hunt was pursuing a stag into woodland when one young man was struck on the head by a rock thrown from the oak trees and fell from his horse. A large, hairy, human-like figure jumped onto the track and pushed over another rider with incredible strength. The bishop himself then brandished his golden crucifix, and the strange animal ran back into the forest. Several hunters attempted to follow, but their horses were too frightened to enter the trees. A few days later, the young man died of his head injuries, and the bishop offered a reward to anyone who could locate the wild man's lair. Nothing came of it. This carving on Lichfield Cathedral is thought to represent the figure encountered by the bishop. Anglo-Saxons called them Woodwose, but later in Middle English the word became Woodwose, meaning the wild man of the woods. This is the earliest record describing the wild men or woodwose of Cannock Chase. But what are they? A kind of savage human? Or something more ape-like, more primitive? In the Middle Ages, woodwose appear frequently in European art and literature. German and Italian engravers often depicted wild men and wild women in their work. In Britain, woodwose are featured on numerous tapestries, bestiaries, and illuminated manuscripts, while carved images can be seen on many churches dating from the same period. Written around 1390 in a Northwest Midlands dialect, the tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight describes a fight between the hero and woodwose who lived among the rocks. Stories of St. John Chrysostom tell how, as a penance for fornicating with a princess and then murdering her, he lived like a beast on all fours, eating only grass and berries, until his sins were forgiven by a child conceived from the coupling. Woodwose are sometimes depicted as nature spirits, but most often they are represented as real flesh and blood creatures who could kill men and ravish women. By the late Middle Ages, woodwose were believed to be people who had descended into madness and either by force or by choice retreated from their communities into the woods and forests. But with no contact from the outside world, how long can a human survive alone in the wilderness? In 1731, a ferocious wild girl was captured by French villagers in the region of Champagne. Christened Marie-Angélique Mamie Leblanc, the girl had been living in the surrounding forests for 10 years, but was taught to speak and later became a respected member of society. A wild boy in another part of France was seen and caught several times, until he finally allowed himself to be taken in 1797. Victor of Aveyron had had almost no human contact for most of his life, and was unable to develop language skills. In the late 1800s, British photographer Peter Dugdale saw two feral children in Coniston. perhaps a brother and sister, living like wild pigs in a slate cave. They were observed by local people for many years, but perished during a particularly severe winter. However, it seems unlikely that cases such as these, as well as the numerous examples from around the world of children raised by wild animals, could explain the many sightings of large, hairy bipeds seen on Cannock Chase. In 1695, Celia Fiennes, England's first woman travel writer, passed through Staffordshire and noted,
"The people of Cankwood collect fern and are thus able to make a living, though I am informed there are parts of the woods where they fear to tread. This is where abide the Woodwose, or wild men, hidden in the tunnels that run under the heath. He is something like a large man and hairy like a bear. Seldom seen, the people hereabouts leave the Woodwose be, lest he take their food or children."
Philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau suggested that all men were born with the potential for goodness, but that civilization created envy and turned them bad. Rousseau thought the so-called savages of Africa and North America were examples of unspoiled humans. Rudyard Kipling's Mowgli, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan, and Florence Blackwell's Lanu are intelligent people living apart from civilization, but who still show an understanding and awareness of justice and morality. The Woodwose of Cannock Chase show no signs of such noble savagery. In 1704, doubting the seaworthiness of the ship he was on, Scottish buccaneer Alexander Selkirk asked his captain to leave him on a small, uninhabited island off the coast of Chile. Forced to move inland by vicious attacks from sea lions, Selkirk made huts and clothes for himself, while also becoming an accomplished goat hunter. 1 year into his sojourn, Selkirk encountered a tall, wild, hairy man in the wooded part of the island. The creature reminded him of Amphir Liathmore, the big grey man, a legend his father had told him when he was a child in Scotland. But in his memoirs he identified the creature as a Woodwose and describes his attempts to communicate with it. After a violent dispute over some goat meat, Selkirk was forced to use gunpowder to scare the creature away. He never saw it again, and afterwards regretted his actions. Selkirk's experiences were later fictionalized by Daniel Defoe as the life and surprising adventures of Robinson Crusoe. Defoe transformed Selkirk's Woodwose into the more human character of Friday, a native man Crusoe rescues and who becomes his ally and companion. In the 1750s, enclosures were constructed on Cannock Chase to farm rabbits. The local populace who used the land revolted. They destroyed warrens and set fire to fences, and it was during one of these so-called rabbit riots that a large hairy creature was captured as it ran from the flames. The injured animal was held in a barn, and witnesses believe the captive was an unusually wild-looking poacher whose clothes must have been burned away. When the strange figure was being transported to the jailhouse in Rugeley, it overcame 5 men and escaped into woodland, where it disappeared for good. In 1775, Dick Slee left full-time employment at Shugborough Hall and asked his employer if he could live as a hermit in a corner of Cannock Chase. Lord Anson agreed, and for some years Slee was visited by children who gave him food and listened to his stories. But one day Slee told them that a Woodwose lived nearby and that they should never be out on the chase at twilight when the creature hunted. The terrified children told their parents and later Lord Anson himself spoke with Slee. The old man swore that the story was true and showed where he had seen the animal, which he described as being as tall and as hairy as a circus bear. No further sightings were reported by Slee, and, grieving over the death of his pet hare, he ended his days in a Rugeley workhouse. Cannock Chase covers 26 square miles of woodland, and coal mining has been carried out in the area since the 1200s. During the Industrial Revolution, extensive coal pits were sunk, worked, and eventually abandoned once they were no longer profitable. 7 centuries of earthworks have left hundreds of miles of tunnels and shafts, now hidden in dense forest. And many folk tales describe monsters and witches living in the subterranean caverns. In 1829, a roof collapsed at a coal pit on the Chase, and 3 miners were trapped underground for almost 2 days. Rescuers worked around the clock, digging through the debris, expecting to find the victims suffocated. Miraculously, all 3 were found alive. One of the survivors claimed that before their safety lamps had run dry, a woodwose had clawed a large hole into their tunnel from an unknown adjacent cave chamber. This enabled fresh air to circulate and kept them breathing until help arrived. A doctor cautioned that the miner was suffering from the effects of an oxygen-poor atmosphere and that the woodwose had simply been an hallucination. This is Emma Watterson. Born with chronic hypertrichosis, she became known as the Woolly Girl of Ipswich. Her family sold her to a travelling circus, and she was exhibited throughout England in the 1840s. In 1847, she was paraded at Lichfield Bower, but apparently escaped and was rumoured to be living on Cannock Chase for some years afterwards. A poet named John Ralph encountered Emma some years later and regularly met her at a secluded spot on the Chase. The last time he saw her, she was accompanied by a human-like figure. Her suit, one might almost say furry, and quite naked. Emma's condition hid her face, and therefore also her emotions. But I believe I sensed sorrow on parting, as the muscular brute pulled her after him. Ralph speculated that Emma may have found a physiologically suitable mate amongst a group of woodwose. He never saw her again. The penny horrible was a cheap form of sensational journalism extremely popular in the second half of the 19th century. Although embellished, the stories were often based on fact, and one such tale from 1867 describes an encounter with a Cannock Chase woodwose said to have taken place 100 years before. The Hunston sisters of Brockton Hall did not return from their weekly ride across Cannock Chase, and their families became concerned. The Penny Horrible describes how the young women were attacked by a woodwose and their bodies found by Lord Hunston and his friends. Lady Martha appeared to have been partially devoured, her remains left in a cave on the Chase. Lady Hannah had apparently escaped from the cave, but had then been accidentally shot and killed by members of a search party hunting for the woodwose. In 1903, a series of cattle mutilations near Cannock Chase led to the conviction of George Idalji, an Indian national. The circumstantial evidence that led to Idalji's arrest included accusations of writing poison pen letters, as well as being seen at night in the vicinity of the attacks. Employing techniques his famous fictional detective had used, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle mounted a campaign to have Idalji's conviction overturned. The creator of Sherlock Holmes was convinced the prosecution had been driven by racism, and that the mutilations were being committed by a desperately hungry Woodwose, perhaps driven by a severe winter. The attacks against livestock continued while Idalji was in prison, and he was eventually granted an early release. No other arrests were made, and the culprit, be it man or beast, was never caught. At the start of World War I, 2 large military training camps were constructed on the Chase at Brockton and Rugeley. Between 1916 and 1918, over 6,000 German prisoners of war were kept at Brockton Camp, many of them crews from captured U-boats. British military documents record that the prisoners were reluctant to attempt an escape, explaining that some of them had heard and even seen the mythical German Wildermann moving in the surrounding trees at night. After the First World War, unemployed miners were set to work on the Chase, planting thousands of Scots pine saplings to create Cannock Chase Forest. It has been suggested that the disturbance to its habitat was directly responsible for a decline in Woodwose sightings. Perhaps the animals prefer oak and birch woodland to pine forest. Castle Ring is an Iron Age hill fort located in the south of Cannock Chase. In 1926, 4 children were playing there when they made an unsettling discovery. Thinking they had found the skeletal remains of a badger, they took the skull back to their home. Their father was curious and showed it to a friend who was a vet. He believed the cranium belonged to a gorilla. A single report in a local newspaper is all that is known about the story. Whether the skull actually belonged to a Woodwose and what happened to it afterward are not reported, and further inquiries have drawn a blank. In the late 1930s, Staffordshire County Council took their cue from the Scottish Tourist Board and began promoting the idea that a mysterious Woodwose lived on the Chase. But whereas tourists to Loch Ness could safely watch for Nessie from the shore, the idea that Cannock Chase might harbour a potentially dangerous and unknown large animal kept people away, and the campaign was swiftly dropped. In the 1950s, the Friends of Cannock Chase produced a series of guides describing the flora and fauna of the area. In one pamphlet, there is a description of a Woodwose seen several times from the triangulation point at Stile Cop. The Cannock Chase Courier sent their photographer, who produced this image using a telescopic lens. While researching this story, we were given access to a home movie taken around the same time as the Stile Cop sightings. Is this the only known moving film of a Woodwose? If the figure is merely a hill walker, why is he walking off the path? More sightings were reported, but the figure was never formally identified. Between 1965 and 1967, 3 young girls were murdered on Cannock Chase. During the investigation, hundreds of police and volunteers scoured the woodland, and it was reported that a cave with human bones had been found. Eyewitnesses spoke to the local press about the discovery, but the police later dismissed the story as an exaggeration of the unearthing of a fox den. However, during a press interview, a correspondent captured a very strange noise.
We wish to extend our gratitude to the general public, some of whom have been helping search the Chase for many hours.
I'm sorry, Inspector. We'll just wait for that noise to...
Doubt it.
Okay, sorry, Inspector. Perhaps I'll ask the question again.
All right, go ahead.
In recent years, local newspapers in the West Midlands have carried reports of what some witnesses have claimed is a British Bigfoot. The descriptions seem to be based on the popular American film hoax showing a man in an ape costume, and bear little similarity with the traditional Woodwose of Cannock Chase. In 1972, the city of Birmingham, only 20 miles from the chase, erected a statue in the city centre. It was widely assumed that the figure represented the fictional giant gorilla King Kong. But rumours persist that the statue was actually inspired by the Cannock Chase Woodwose. As man continues to explore his world, he begins to appreciate how much he does not know. 100 years ago, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, and since then, scientists have discovered incredible abilities in creatures everywhere, the result of millions of years of evolution and adaptation. But beyond courtship displays and advantages for hunting or hiding, much of what we observe in animals remains a mystery. We should always remember that we ourselves experience the world using our meager 5 senses, whilst creatures such as bats and dolphins employ sonar, radar, and infrared vision, far beyond our own capabilities. Who knows how many creatures have evolved powers outside the scope of our own limited perceptions? Creatures able to hide in full view from predators, using physiological mechanisms we do not as yet understand.